In the early 14th century, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon stood as titans of Christendom. They were warrior monks, the ultimate fusion of piety and martial prowess, their name a whisper of fear in the hearts of their enemies. From the deserts of the Holy Land to the financial heart of Europe, their influence was absolute, their wealth legendary. They answered to no king, no bishop, only to the Pope himself, a privilege that bred unparalleled arrogance and dangerous enemies. But a shadow was stretching across Europe, a shadow cast by a king who was as pious as he was cruel and as ambitious as he was broke. King Philip IV of France, known as the Fair for his handsome features, possessed a soul as cold and hard as the iron of his crown. His kingdom was bleeding money, crippled by endless wars and his own lavish spending, and Philip's gaze fell upon the one institution richer than any kingdom, the Knights Templar. The king's debt to the order was a stone around his neck, a constant, humiliating reminder of his weakness and their strength. He saw not saviors or financiers, but a state within his state, an intolerable challenge to his absolute authority. This debt would not be repaid with gold, but with blood and fire, a currency Philip was all too willing to mint. To orchestrate his unholy plan, Philip needed a man as ruthless and unburdened by conscience as himself. He found such a man in Guillaume de Nogaret, his keeper of the seal. De Nogaret was a lawyer whose grandfather had been burned as a heretic, a wound that festered into a deep-seated hatred for the church's power. He was a creature of shadow and whispers, the perfect instrument for a king's darkest ambitions. The final piece of the puzzle was the Pope himself. After the contentious reign of Pope Boniface VIII, who had been humiliated and captured by Nogaret's men, Philip engineered the election of a Frenchman, Bertrand de Got, who became Pope Clement V. Clement was a weak, sickly man, a puppet whose strings were pulled from Paris, not Rome. He moved the papacy to Avignon, effectively placing it under the French king's shadow. The first whispers of heresy were cultivated like a poison garden. The source was a man named Esquiu de Florin, a disgraced and expelled Templar with a vendetta. Imprisoned for his own crimes, he sought a royal pardon by offering a more valuable prize, the secrets of the Templars. He spun tales of blasphemous initiation rites, of spitting on the cross, and of the worship of a demonic idol named Baphomet. For 2 years, de Nogaret's agents secretly collected and embellished these dark rumors. They sought out other disgruntled knights, mercenaries and servants who had been cast out of the order for theft, insubordination, or worse. These men were offered freedom, gold, and royal protection in exchange for their testimony. Their lies were meticulously recorded, shaping a narrative of depravity that was as fantastical as it was damnable. The charges were designed for maximum shock and horror, crafted to turn public opinion against the once revered knights. They were accused of denying Christ and spitting on the crucifix during their secret initiation ceremonies. It was a charge of ultimate blasphemy, designed to sever the Templars from the very faith they were sworn to defend, painting them as an enemy within the heart of Christendom. They were accused of institutionalized sodomy, a sin that the medieval world viewed with absolute terror and disgust. This charge aimed to corrupt their image as warrior monks, transforming their celibate brotherhood into a secret den of vice and unnatural lust. It was a powerful tool of dehumanization, making it easier to justify their persecution in the eyes of a deeply conservative society. The most outlandish charge was the worship of an idol, a mysterious bearded head known as Baphomet. No two descriptions of this idol were ever the same. Some said it had 3 faces, others that it was a polished skull. This accusation transformed them from heretics into pagans and demon worshippers, a sinister cult hiding behind the mask of Christian piety, justifying the full force of the Inquisition against them. With his manufactured evidence in hand, Philip moved to secure the Pope's complicity. He presented Clement with a dossier of these horrific, coerced testimonies. The weak-willed Pope was horrified and cornered. While he initially resisted a direct assault on an order under his personal protection, Philip threatened him, reminding him of the fate of his predecessor, Boniface. Cornered and afraid, Clement buckled, giving a reluctant, ambiguous blessing to an inquiry. The Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was an old man, a veteran of the Crusades, but perhaps not the sharpest political mind. He was summoned from Cyprus to France under false pretext to discuss a new crusade. De Molay, oblivious to the storm gathering around him, arrived in Paris in early 1307. He was an honored guest of the king, dining with him and serving as a pallbearer for a royal funeral, all while Philip was finalizing the warrants for his arrest. The order was given in absolute secrecy. Throughout the summer of 1307, sealed letters were dispatched to royal seneschals and bailiffs across the entire Kingdom of France. The instructions were precise and chilling. The letters were not to be opened until the night of Thursday, October 12th. Inside was the royal command for a synchronized, kingdom-wide arrest of every Templar to be carried out at dawn the next day. The date chosen was Friday, the 13th. While not yet associated with the superstition it holds today, the day would become infamous. It was a masterstroke of logistics and terror. At a single moment, the most powerful military order in France was to be decapitated, its members dragged from their beds before they could comprehend what was happening, before they could even think to raise a sword in their own defense. In the pre-dawn darkness of Friday, October 13th, 1307, the king's trap was sprung. Armed soldiers and royal agents surrounded every Templar preceptory, from the Grand Paris Temple to the smallest rural commandery. They moved like ghosts in the gloom, their swords drawn, their orders absolute. The knights, who had slept as the respected soldiers of Christ, were about to awaken into a nightmare. The doors were smashed open with axes and battering rams. The soldiers stormed in, overwhelming the handful of guards. Templars, many of them old men, were dragged from their beds, confused and half-dressed. They were met not with explanation, but with the cold points of swords and the harsh grip of iron shackles. There was no negotiation, no reading of charges, only brutal, efficient force. In Paris, the grand prize was the temple itself, the order's European headquarters. Jacques de Molay and his senior knights were seized without a fight. They were warriors, but they were also men of God and subjects of the king. They could not fathom that the King of France, the most Christian king, would move against them. Their confusion was as much a weapon against them as the steel of their captors. Across France, the scene was repeated hundreds of times over. Knights who had faced down armies in the Holy Land were bound and shackled by their own countrymen. Sergeants, chaplains, and servants of the order were rounded up alongside them. The efficiency was terrifying. In a single morning, an organization that had stood for 2 centuries was broken, its members imprisoned, its command structure shattered. Immediately, the king's men seized all of the order's property. They were not just arresting men. They were conducting a corporate seizure on an unprecedented scale. Account books, land deeds, and most importantly, treasure chests were confiscated. While the legendary Templar treasure was never found, Philip's agents stripped the preceptories of every last coin, relic, and bushel of grain. The motive behind the arrests was laid bare. It was a state-sanctioned armed robbery. With the Templars in chains, the second phase of Philip's plan began: propaganda. Royal agents proclaimed the news from every town square, reading out the lurid list of charges. The people who had once revered the Templars were stunned. The accusations of heresy, sodomy, and idol worship were so shocking, so vile, that they overwhelmed disbelief. The king was not just destroying the Templars' bodies, but their very name and reputation. The prisoners were thrown into the king's darkest dungeons, places of filth, cold, and despair. They were isolated from one another, left to languish in darkness, weakened by meager rations and the gnawing terror of the unknown. This was a deliberate strategy to break their spirit, to soften them up before the interrogations began. The proud knights were reduced to shivering, starving men, their resolve eroded by fear and isolation. Then came the torturers. These were not soldiers, but specialists in the art of inflicting pain employed by the Royal Inquisition. They arrived with their terrifying tools, the rack, the strappado, the glowing braziers and iron boots. Their goal was not to find the truth, but to secure a confession. Any confession. The charges were already decided. All that was needed was for the prisoners to admit to them. The strappado was a common method. The knight's hands were tied behind his back, and the rope was slung over a pulley on the ceiling. He would be hoisted into the air, dislocating his shoulders with an agonizing tearing of ligaments and muscle. He would be left hanging for hours, the torment excruciating. The torturers would ask their questions, and if the answers were unsatisfactory, they would drop him suddenly, only to jerk him to a halt, sending fresh waves of agony through his ruined shoulders. The rack was a machine of pure torment, a wooden frame designed to stretch a man's body until his joints popped from their sockets. The Templar would be shackled at the wrists and ankles, and a roller at each end would be slowly turned, pulling his limbs in opposite directions. The sound of sinews stretching and bones cracking would fill the chamber, a symphony of suffering conducted by the inquisitors until the victims will finally broke. Another favored technique was torturing the feet. The prisoner would be bound to a chair, his feet locked in a greased iron vise. A brazier of hot coals would then be brought close, slowly roasting the soles of his feet. The flesh would blister, burn, and blacken. One Templar later testified that the burned bones of his feet fell off when he was returned to his cell. The pain was beyond comprehension, a living hell designed to shatter the strongest of men. Under such duress, men will say anything. The knights, broken in body and spirit, began to confess. They admitted to spitting on the cross, to denying Christ, to the obscene kiss of shame. They confessed to worshipping a cat or a bearded head. The confessions were often contradictory and nonsensical, but it didn't matter. The scribes wrote it all down, creating the damning evidence the king required. Even the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was broken. The old warrior endured the torment until he could take no more. He confessed to the charge of spitting on the cross, a single, damning admission that was immediately used against the entire order. The confession of their leader, extracted through unspeakable pain, was a devastating blow, giving the king's persecution a veneer of legitimacy. The news of the arrests and confessions finally reached Pope Clement, who was both furious and terrified. He had been outmaneuvered by the king. This was supposed to be a papal inquiry, but Philip had acted unilaterally, using his own agents and the brutal methods of his own inquisition. Clement understood that the Templars were his order, his responsibility, and their fate now rested in his weak, trembling hands. In a rare display of spine, Clement issued a papal bull suspending the French Inquisition's trials. He declared that the fate of the Templars was a matter for the Church, and the Church alone. He demanded that the prisoners and their property be turned over to papal custody. For a moment, it seemed like the Pope might stand up to the king, that the Templars might receive a fair hearing under canon law rather than royal tyranny. Philip's response was swift and furious. He launched a vicious propaganda campaign against the Pope himself, dredging up old charges against Clement's predecessor, Boniface VIII, and threatening to put him on trial posthumously for heresy. It was pure blackmail. The message was clear: defy me, and I will destroy you and the reputation of the papacy itself. The pressure on Clement was immense. The king assembled the Estates General, the representative body of France, to rally public support. In a masterful display of political theater, his ministers presented the evidence against the Templars. The coerced confessions were read aloud to a horrified assembly. By framing the issue as a defense of the Catholic faith against a monstrous internal enemy, Philip turned his personal vendetta into a national crusade, isolating the Pope further. Under this relentless pressure, Clement capitulated once more. In the summer of 1308, he buckled, issuing another bull that effectively restarted the trials, this time under a joint authority of papal and royal inquisitors. He had tried to resist, but the king's will was too strong. The brief glimmer of hope for the Templars was extinguished. They were once again at the mercy of their tormentors. However, the new papal commissions offered a small, crucial change. The Templars were now allowed to mount a defense. When brought before the papal commissioners in Paris, away from the king's immediate torturers, something remarkable happened. The knights, hearing that the pope was now in charge, began to retract their confessions en masse. They found their courage, their voices, and their honor. Hundreds of knights stepped forward to defend the order. They described, in horrifying detail, the tortures they had endured. They explained how they had lied to save their own lives, confessing to crimes they had never committed. Led by eloquent and brave knights like Pierre de Boulogne and Renaud de Provence, they organized a coherent and powerful defense, arguing the innocence of their brotherhood. Even Jacques de Molay, brought before the papal cardinals, found his spine. When his own forced confession was read back to him, he was reportedly aghast. He proclaimed his innocence and that of his order, renouncing the words that had been tortured out of him. The Grand Master's retraction sent shockwaves through the proceedings. The king's case, built entirely on coerced confessions, was beginning to crumble. Philip and de Nogaret watched this development with fury. Their perfectly constructed case was falling apart. The Templars' defense was gaining traction, and the papal commission seemed to be listening. If the knights were acquitted, the king would not only be denied their wealth, but he would also be exposed as a thief, a liar, and a tyrant who had brutally tortured innocent men. He could not allow that to happen. The king decided to make an example. He found a legal loophole, a dark corner of inquisitorial law. Any heretic who confessed and then later recanted their confession was deemed a relapsed heretic. And for a relapsed heretic, there was no mercy, no trial, no appeal. The only sentence was death by fire. It was the perfect, monstrous solution to his problem. On May 12, 1310, Philip, acting through his puppet Archbishop of Sens, bypassed the papal commission entirely. He declared 54 of the knights who had recanted their confessions to be relapsed heretics. These men, who had bravely spoken the truth to defend their order, were condemned to be burned at the stake. There would be no more defense, only a terrifying spectacle of royal power. That same day, the 54 knights were taken to a field outside of Paris. They were bound to stakes, with wood and straw piled high around their feet. They were offered a final chance to save themselves. Reaffirm your original confessions, and you will be spared the fire. Every single one of them refused. They chose a horrific death over dishonoring their order with another lie. As the sun set, the pyres were lit. The flames licked at the dry kindling, then roared to life, engulfing the condemned men. Their screams echoed through the Parisian night, a sound of unimaginable agony. They died proclaiming their innocence and the purity of the order, their last breaths choked by smoke and fire. It was a calculated act of state-sponsored terror, a message to every other Templar: your defense ends here. The message was received. The Templars' defense collapsed overnight. The remaining knights, terrified by the fate of their brothers, fell silent or reverted to their original coerced confessions. Who could blame them? The choice was no longer between truth and lies, but between a quick lie and a slow, agonizing death. Philip had won. He had silenced his victims with the unanswerable argument of fire. With the opposition crushed, Pope Clement formally convened the Council of Vienne in 1312. His original intention may have been a proper trial, but it was now a mere formality. The king's soldiers surrounded the town, a clear threat to any churchman who might consider voting for the Templars' innocence. The council was a sham, its outcome preordained by fear and political force. Even at the council, some brave bishops argued that the order should be allowed to present a defense, as was their right under canon law. but the pressure from Philip was too great. In the end, Clement used a procedural maneuver. He did not condemn the order for heresy, as there was still no credible proof, but instead suppressed it for the good of the Church, citing the scandal that had tainted its name. It was a legalistic way of giving the king what he wanted. With the papal bull Vox in Excelso, the Order of the Knights Templar was officially and permanently dissolved. Their vast wealth and properties were ordered to be transferred to their rivals, the Knights Hospitaller. In reality, Philip IV and other monarchs across Europe intercepted a huge portion of it, using it to pay off their expenses for the trial. The great robbery was complete, sanctified by the highest authority in Christendom. The fate of the individual knights varied. Most of those who had confessed were reconciled with the Church and sentenced to life in monastic prisons, their spirits broken. Others, particularly in regions outside of France where torture was not used, were often found innocent and released. In Portugal, the order was simply rebranded, becoming the Order of Christ. But for the leaders in Philip's clutches, the end was not yet written. For 7 years, Jacques de Molay and other high-ranking Templars, including Geoffrey de Charny, the preceptor of Normandy, languished in prison. Their final fate was left in limbo. In March of 1314, a commission of cardinals was convened on a platform in front of Notre Dame Cathedral to deliver their final sentence, perpetual imprisonment. But as the sentence was read, something inside the old Grand Master finally snapped. He had lived with the shame of his forced confession for 7 years. Faced with a life of silent ignominy, he chose a death of fiery defiance. He and Geoffrey de Charny suddenly cried out, interrupting the proceedings. They loudly and forcefully recanted their confessions for the last time, proclaiming their innocence and the sanctity of the Templar order to the stunned crowd. King Philip, who was present, was incandescent with rage. This was a public humiliation he could not tolerate. He immediately declared them relapsed heretics, bypassing the cardinals and any semblance of church law. There would be no more delay. He ordered them to be burned that very evening on a small island in the Seine, within sight of the royal palace. As the flames rose around him, Jacques de Molay displayed a courage that stunned all who watched. He asked to have his hands untied so he could face the Cathedral of Notre Dame and die in prayer. He showed no fear, his voice remaining strong and clear in the fire. His final act was not one of a broken heretic, but of a martyr, sealing the innocence of his order in his own blood and ashes. Legend holds that with his last breath, Jacques de Molay issued a terrible curse. He shouted from the flames, summoning Pope Clement and King Philip to join him before God's tribunal within the year. He cursed the king, the pope, and all their descendants, a final, ghostly vengeance from the heart of the inferno. Whether it was a curse or a coincidence, fate moved swiftly. Pope Clement V died just 1 month later from a sudden, agonizing illness. His body, lying in state, was struck by lightning, and the resulting fire nearly consumed his corpse. The first part of the prophecy had come true with shocking speed. Later that same year, King Philip IV, the Iron King, suffered a stroke while hunting. He fell from his horse and died within weeks, still in his prime. The man who had destroyed the Templars for their wealth and his own power was dead. Within a year of de Molay's execution, both of his chief persecutors had met their end. The curse did not end there. Over the next 14 years, Philip's 3 sons all reigned as king, but each died young, leaving no male heirs. The direct line of the Capetian dynasty, which had ruled France for over 3 centuries, was extinguished. The throne passed to a new house, plunging France into the chaos and bloodshed of the 100 Years' War. De Molay's curse, it seemed, had a long and terrible memory. The destruction of the Templars was a brutal lesson in the fragility of power. They were brought down not by a foreign army, but by the greed and paranoia of one man armed with the machinery of the state. King Philip demonstrated how law, religion, and public opinion could be twisted into weapons to annihilate an enemy and seize their wealth, a dark blueprint for future tyrants. In the end, the truth of the charges against the Templars remains shrouded in mystery, though historians overwhelmingly agree the order was innocent of heresy. The accusations were a pretext, the confessions were worthless products of torture, and the trials were a legal farce. The Templars were not heretics. They were victims of the first great show trial of European history, a cautionary tale written in blood and fire. The story of their fall, from the dawn raid on Friday the 13th to the final curse from the flames, has echoed through the centuries. It has become a dark legend of betrayal, a chilling reminder of how quickly the heroes of one age can become the heretics of the next, and how the insatiable greed for power can lead even the most Christian king to commit the most unholy of sins.